I never thought I would be the villain in my own story. But I suppose that's how my husband, Ethan, sees me now. And maybe, just maybe, he's right. It all started with a house. My father, Richard, had finally purchased his dream home. A sprawling estate outside the city, the kind of place he had always promised himself he would retire in. After years of scraping and saving, he had closed the deal, and now he wanted to celebrate. He had planned a housewarming party for months, inviting family, friends, business partners, anyone who mattered in his world. And in Richard's world, status and appearances meant everything. The problem? The day he picked for the party was the same day as my son's funeral. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. But my father saw things differently. To him, death was just another inconvenience, something to be processed and moved past. My son Caleb was only 7 when he died, struck by a drunk driver while playing outside. Ethan had been the one watching him. At least he was supposed to be. But he got distracted. A phone call, a split second of inattention, and Caleb was gone. Ethan never forgave himself. And if I'm honest, neither did I. My grief became something bitter. Something I buried, locked away. I couldn't stand being in the house with Ethan anymore. The air felt thick with blame, with things unsaid, with the knowledge that if I had been the one outside that day, maybe, just maybe, Caleb would still be alive. So when my father told me he wasn't moving the party, I didn't fight him. "It's a minor event, Emily," my father had said over the phone, his tone dismissive. "A tragedy, sure, but life moves forward. This party is important to me. You should be there." I had hesitated, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Dad, it's my son's funeral. And what good will it do you standing over a casket? The boy is gone, Emily. But I'm still here. You're still here. This party, this house is your future. You can either drown in the past with Ethan, or you can move forward with me." I should have hated him for saying that. But the truth? I wanted to move forward. Ethan had spent the last 3 weeks in a haze of grief. He barely spoke. He barely ate. He just existed, shuffling from room to room, staring at Caleb's empty bed like he expected our son to come running back at any moment. And I couldn't take it anymore. So when my father asked me where I'd be that evening, I told him the truth. "I'll be at the party." I didn't tell Ethan. I knew he'd never understand, never forgive me. But what was left of our marriage anyway? When I looked at him, all I saw was Caleb's absence, the gaping hole between us. And when Ethan looked at me, I think he saw something worse. So on the day of my son's funeral, I stood beside my husband at the church, dressed in black, playing the role of the grieving mother. I let the tears fall at the right moments. I held Ethan's hand, even as his grip felt cold and distant. And when the service ended, when the final words were spoken and the mourners started to leave, I did something unforgivable. I let go of Ethan's hand, walked to my car, and drove away. I didn't follow him to the cemetery. I didn't watch as they lowered our son's coffin into the ground. Instead, I went to my father's new house, slipped into a sleek black dress, and stepped into the party like nothing had happened. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel suffocated by grief. I let myself drink champagne, smile, talk to people who didn't know, who didn't care, that I had buried my child that morning. My father was right. I could move forward. And then sometime after midnight, Ethan arrived. I will never forget the way he looked. He stood at the entrance of my father's house, his funeral suit still wrinkled, his tie loose around his neck, his face pale with fury and betrayal. And then, in front of everyone, he uttered the words that changed everything. "Get out," he said. First, I thought he was talking to me. But then my father laughed, stepping forward. "Ethan, be reasonable. You're acting like a... I own this house, Richard." Silence. My father's face went pale. The party came to a halt. Murmurs spread through the crowd. And I stood there, frozen, as my husband, my grieving, broken husband, smiled a slow, dangerous smile. And then I realized, this wasn't just a housewarming party. It was a reckoning that I had never seen Ethan look so calm. Not in the way a man at peace looks calm, but in the way a storm settles before it rips everything apart. He stood there at the entrance, his suit still damp from the rain outside, his eyes hollow and burning with something deeper than anger. My father, always the businessman, was the first to regain his composure. He stepped forward, plastering a tight smile across his face. Ethan, let's not cause a scene, he said smoothly, voice low enough that only those closest could hear. There are important people here. Ethan didn't even blink. I don't give a damn who's here. The murmurs grew louder. I could feel the tension thick in the air, eyes darting between Ethan, my father, and me. But I was still frozen, my mind scrambling to process what he had just said. I own this house. That didn't make any sense. My father had just bought this place. He had spent weeks boasting about the renovations, the square footage, the status that came with it. And yet, Ethan stood there, shoulders squared, as if he had just pulled the ground from beneath my father's feet. Ethan. I finally found my voice, stepping forward. What are you talking about? He barely looked at me. Instead, he pulled something from the inside of his suit jacket and tossed it onto the grand marble staircase that led to the second floor. The papers landed with a crisp flutter, some sliding down a step or two. A contract. My father's face paled. What the hell is this? He snapped, reaching down and snatching the papers up. He flipped through them, his expression tightening with every passing second. Deed transfer, Ethan said simply. I blinked. My father's head jerked up. That's impossible. Ethan smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Is it? My father turned to me, as if I had any answers. But I was just as confused. No, my father muttered, shaking his head. I bought this house. Ethan tilted his head. Did you? Silence. I could hear the ice clinking in someone's glass. The nervous shift of feet against polished wood floors. The weight of 100 different thoughts racing through my father's mind as he finally realized what was happening. You see, Ethan continued, his voice almost conversational, I had a feeling something like this would happen. Not the party necessarily. No, that was just an extra little gift. But I knew you, Richard. I knew you would try to move on before your grandson was even cold in the ground. The words hit like a slap. I flinched. But my father. He scoffed. This is ridiculous. You're ridiculous. He held up the deed. I paid for this house. Ethan nodded. With a private loan. The color drained from my father's face. My stomach dropped. Oh no. No. My father's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. I had never seen my father speechless before. Ah, Ethan said, as if something had just occurred to him. There it is. That moment when you realize you've been playing a game you never even knew you were in. I swallowed, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, what did you do? Now he looked at me. And in his eyes I saw it. The depth of his pain, the rage, the betrayal. But underneath it all there was something worse. Finality. I bought the debt, he said simply. The room started spinning. My father had been talking for weeks about how quickly he closed on the house, how lucky he had been to secure the right financing, how the bank had worked unbelievably fast to push the sale through. But now I saw it for what it really was. Ethan had been behind it the entire time. Oh, you think that's not possible? Ethan continued, now looking back at my father. Let me explain something to you, Richard. You're used to running in certain circles, powerful circles, sure, but you don't know the first thing about navigating real financial warfare. I do. You bastard, my father hissed. Ethan grinned. Yes. And now this bastard owns your home. The weight of his words settled over the room like a thick fog. No one moved. No one spoke. Pack your things, Ethan said, his voice turning sharp. The party's over. A few guests started whispering. Someone cleared their throat awkwardly. My father, however, did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or a defeated scoff. It was a full, hearty laugh. The kind that usually came right before he went for the kill. You think this is over? My father asked, shaking his head. You may have pulled a clever trick, but don't fool yourself into thinking this is checkmate. Ethan just smiled. No, Richard. That's where you're mistaken. I didn't do this to win some game against you. He took a slow step forward, lowering his voice so that only those of us standing closest could hear. I did this to bury you. And then just like that he turned on his heel and walked out the door. No dramatic exit. No final words. Just a man who had come to deliver justice, and left before anyone could stop him. The moment the door clicked shut, my father turned to me. His expression thunderous. What the hell did you do? He seethed. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I had no answer. Because for the first time I realized something terrifying. I had backed the wrong man. I stood there, stunned, as the guests began filtering out of my father's house. No, Ethan's house. Murmuring to one another, exchanging glances that ranged from amusement to shock to thinly veiled delight. The rich love a scandal, and Ethan had just delivered one on a silver platter. My father's face was rigid, a statue of barely contained fury. His hand clenched the deed so tightly that the paper crinkled. "This is a joke," he muttered under his breath. "A bluff." I swallowed, trying to find something, anything, to say that would make this situation make sense. But there was nothing. Ethan had planned this for weeks, maybe even longer. He had trapped my father in a deal so tight that there was no way out. My father didn't own this house. Ethan did. And that meant, "This can't stand," my father said, turning to me with sharp eyes. "I'll get my lawyers involved first thing in the morning." I hesitated. "Dad, if the paperwork is real." He whirled on me. "Don't be a coward, Emily. That man," he spat the word like it was poison, "thinks he can humiliate me. You think I'm going to let that slide?" But I couldn't finish the sentence because for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was on his side anymore. Because a dark, ugly truth had settled into my bones, something I had been pushing away for weeks. Ethan had been grieving. He had been mourning our son, and I had abandoned him in his pain. And yet, here my father stood, acting as if he was the one who had been wronged. "Get your things," he snapped, his voice cutting into my thoughts. "What?" "We're leaving," he said. "I'll have my assistant find us a suite at the Ritz. We'll handle this in the morning." I blinked. Dad, my words stuck in my throat. My instincts, the ones trained over years of obedience, told me to follow him, to pack my bags and go with him because that's what I had always done. I had always chosen his approval. But tonight something felt different. I glanced around, noticing the shifting glances from the remaining guests. The realization dawned that this wasn't just about Ethan. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about me. I had stood at my son's funeral, played the part of the grieving mother, and then abandoned my husband to drown in his sorrow while I drank champagne at my father's party. I had chosen my father's world over my marriage. And now I was standing in the ruins of that choice. "Emily," my father barked, impatient. "Let's go." I exhaled slowly, my fingers trembling as I pulled my clutch closer to my body. "No." My father's head snapped toward me. "What?" I met his eyes, my chest tightening. I swallowed. "I need to talk to Ethan." A short, bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Talk to him? You mean the man who just tried to publicly destroy me?" "Dad, I stopped myself before the words tumbled out, but it was too late. "He didn't do this to destroy you. He did this because of me." And I realized with a deep, sickening clarity that my father didn't even care about the part that mattered most, Caleb. He wasn't angry that I had abandoned my son's funeral for his party. He wasn't angry that Ethan was grieving alone. He wasn't angry about any of it. He was angry because Ethan had embarrassed him. My stomach twisted. This was the man I had chosen over my husband. "Emily," my father said, his voice dangerously low. "You are not going to that man." I flinched. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I realized something else. My father wasn't used to losing. But tonight he had lost everything. And so had I. I took a step back. "I have to go." "Emily." "I'm sorry," I whispered before turning on my heel and walking out the door. The drive home was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing, my heart pounding. What was I even going to say to Ethan? I had chosen my father over him. Over us. Over Caleb. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the gnawing sense of injustice that curled in my stomach. Yes, I had made my choice. Yes, I had abandoned my husband in his grief. But Ethan, he had set me up to fail. I replayed the night in my mind. The way he had appeared at the party, waiting for the perfect moment to drop his bombshell. He had planned every second of it. He wanted me to feel this way. He wanted me to suffer. A fresh wave of anger flooded through me, a bitter, conflicting mess of guilt and resentment. Maybe I deserved his rage. Maybe I deserved his hatred. But did I deserve this? When I finally pulled into the driveway of our home, The place that had felt so suffocating these last few weeks. I hesitated. The lights were on. Ethan was awake. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. I wasn't ready for this. But then again, I wasn't sure if I ever would be. I opened the door. Ethan was sitting in the living room, whiskey glass in hand, his posture eerily relaxed. He didn't look up. "You're back," he said simply. I swallowed. "We need to talk." He swirled the glass in his hand. "Now you want to talk." I took a slow step forward. "Ethan." His hand slammed the glass onto the coffee table, the sharp sound making me jump. "You didn't bury our son," he said, voice low, razor sharp. "But you buried me." The words knocked the breath out of me. And for the first time since Caleb's death, I realized there were things worse than grief. And the man in front of me? He was about to teach me every single one. Ethan sat there, his fingers still curled around the base of his whiskey glass, watching me with the kind of expression that made my stomach twist. There was no warmth, no lingering love, not even the remnants of pain. Just cold detachment. I took a step closer cautiously. "Ethan, Don't," he cut in sharply. I froze. He leaned back against the couch, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You don't get to come home after the circus you just left and act like there's anything left to say." I swallowed hard. I had known this conversation would be brutal, but now that I was here standing in front of him, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a battlefield. Unarmed, unprepared. I wanted to tell him that I was sorry, that I hadn't thought things through, that I had let my father's influence cloud my judgment. But the words tangled in my throat, because no matter how much I tried to justify it, the truth was simple. I had abandoned Ethan. I had chosen a party over our son's funeral. And the worst part? I hadn't even truly realized what I was doing until Ethan made me see it. I tried again, but Ethan just laughed under his breath, shaking his head. It wasn't a bitter laugh. It wasn't even mocking. It was the kind of laugh that said, "I don't recognize you anymore." "You know," he said after a long moment, rubbing his jaw, "I spent weeks trying to understand, trying to rationalize why you weren't hurting the same way I was." His voice was steady, but the emotion behind it was anything but. "You slept through the nights while I lay awake in Caleb's room. You went back to work, back to your routine, while I barely remembered how to breathe." His jaw tensed. "You stopped looking at me the way you used to, and I told myself, she's just grieving differently. That's what everyone kept telling me, right?" I lowered my gaze, shame creeping in. "But then," he continued, "then I realized something." I hesitated. "What?" His voice was quiet, deadly. "You weren't grieving at all." My breath hitched. "That's not true." Ethan's lips twitched into something resembling amusement. "Isn't it?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and for the first time, his eyes locked onto mine with something dangerously close to hatred. "You threw on your black dress, held my hand in front of the mourners, and then drove straight to your father's house like it was any other night." I flinched. Ethan's expression didn't change. "Tell me, Emily," he said softly, tilting his head. "How did that first glass of champagne taste? Did it wash the grief away? Did it make you forget that our son was lying in a wooden box while you laughed with your father's friends?" Tears burned in my eyes. "That's not fair." His eyes darkened. "Not fair." I barely saw it coming. The next thing I knew, Ethan shot to his feet, sending the whiskey glass flying off the table. It shattered against the floor, amber liquid spilling into the cracks of the hardwood. I took an instinctive step back. Ethan wasn't a violent man. He had never laid a hand on me, never even raised his voice in anger the way he had just now. But this was different. This was grief-fueled rage. "You're standing here telling me that I'm not being fair," he seethed, voice shaking. "When you spent our son's funeral night sipping champagne with the same man who called his death a minor event?" I sucked in a breath, blinking rapidly. "Ethan." "No," he cut me off with an icy glare. "You don't get to speak." "Not yet." I fell silent. Ethan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, rawer. "You weren't just my wife, Emily. You were Caleb's mother. And instead of grieving with me, instead of mourning the way a mother should, you walked away. You let your father dictate your actions. And the worst part," he let out a hollow chuckle, You didn't even hesitate. I swallowed, my voice trembling. I didn't know what I was doing. His expression twisted into something cruel. No, Emily. You knew exactly what you were doing. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to fight back, to defend myself, but what could I say? That my father had convinced me? That I had been so desperate to escape the weight of grief that I had clung to the only thing that felt familiar? That I had chosen comfort over pain? That I had chosen wrong? Ethan sighed, his shoulders sinking. The rage in his eyes flickered, but the damage had been done. I'm done, Emily, he muttered. I'm so done. My stomach twisted. You don't mean that. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, moving toward the staircase without so much as a glance in my direction. Ethan, I called after him, my voice cracking. Please. Still he didn't stop. I watched as he climbed the stairs, his steps slow, deliberate. And then he was gone. I stood there, my chest rising and falling unevenly, staring at the shattered glass on the floor. I had never felt so alone. Not even when we lost Caleb. Not even when I had sat in my car outside my father's party, knowing deep down that I was making a mistake but not wanting to face it. 'Cause now it was too late. I had abandoned Ethan. And now? Now he was abandoning me. The house felt unbearably quiet after Ethan disappeared upstairs. I stood frozen, staring at the shattered whiskey glass on the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to go after him. To fix this. To fix us. But how do you repair something when you're the one who shattered it in the first place? I finally moved, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood as I crouched down to pick up the broken shards. My hands trembled, and for a brief, stupid second, I thought about just letting the glass cut me. Maybe if I bled, if I hurt, it would make things even. Maybe it would make me feel something other than the choking guilt that wrapped itself around my throat. I pressed my lips together and forced the thought away. I was losing Ethan. I had already lost Caleb. And now I was trapped in the wreckage of my own making. The night dragged on. I didn't go upstairs. I didn't even sleep. I sat in the living room, curled up on the couch, staring at the darkened staircase, hoping, praying that Ethan would come down. That he'd give me a chance to explain, to beg, to plead if I had to. But he never did. And when the first slivers of morning sunlight filtered through the windows, I finally realized. He wasn't coming back to me. By noon I couldn't take it anymore. I found him in Caleb's room. He was standing by the window, his back to me, staring out at the backyard where our son used to play. The air in the room was heavy, thick with ghosts and memories that neither of us could escape. Ethan, I murmured. He didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge me. I took a hesitant step inside. I know you don't want to hear this, but I need to talk to you. Nothing. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the fabric of my dress. I know I hurt you. A bitter chuckle escaped him. Hurt me. He finally turned, his face unreadable. Emily, you didn't just hurt me. You buried me alongside our son. The words cut like knives and I flinched. Ethan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. What do you want? I hesitated. What did I want? I wanted to undo everything. I wanted to go back to the moment I stepped out of that funeral and stop myself from leaving. I wanted Caleb back. I wanted my husband back. I want to fix this, I whispered. Ethan's jaw clenched. You can't. I took a step forward. Please, Ethan. I made a mistake. I let my father. Your father. He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. Emily, this isn't about your father. This is about you. I know, I admitted, my voice breaking. I let him convince me that moving forward was more important than grieving. That I couldn't let myself drown in the pain. I didn't realize what I was doing until it was too late. His eyes darkened. No, you realized, Emily. You just didn't care. I did care, I insisted, desperate. I do care. He scoffed. Then why did I have to be the one to remind you that our son's funeral wasn't an inconvenience? Tears welled in my eyes. I don't know. Ethan stared at me for a long, suffocating moment before sighing. You should go back to your father's house. My heart stopped. What? You heard me. He turned back toward the window, his voice hollow. You made your choice, Emily. Go be with him. I shook my head quickly. No, I'm not going back to him. Ethan's shoulders tensed. Then what do you expect, Emily? That we'll just go back to normal? That I'll wake up tomorrow and pretend that my wife didn't abandon me in my worst moment? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I don't expect anything. I need you to know that I'm sorry. Ethan let out a breath, slow and measured. It's not enough. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. And then he said the words that I wasn't ready for. I want a divorce. The world tilted. I staggered back, my breath catching. No. Ethan turned to face me, and this time there was no anger. No hatred. Just exhaustion. I can't do this anymore, Emily. Panic clawed its way up my throat. You don't mean that. I do. I shook my head wildly. Ethan, please. We can work through this. We can go to therapy, we can. No, he said firmly. We can't. I felt my legs wobble beneath me. You don't mean that. I do, he repeated, softer this time. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I loved you, Emily. I trusted you. And you made it clear that I was nothing compared to your father. Tears spilled down my cheeks. That's not true. He sighed, shaking his head. You need to leave. I let out a choke sob. I can't. Ethan looked at me then, his expression unreadable. And for a fleeting second I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came. You already did. And with that, he walked past me, leaving me alone in our son's room. I stood there, my chest heaving, my vision blurred with tears. Ethan had just told me the truth. I had already left him. And now he was making sure I never came back. I sat on the floor of Caleb's room long after Ethan left, the walls closing in on me. The tiny race car bed was still made, untouched for weeks. His favorite stuffed animals lined the shelves, their plastic eyes staring back at me, accusing. I reached out, running my fingers over a worn-out teddy bear, the one he never went to sleep without. I had abandoned this room. I had abandoned him. And now I had abandoned Ethan too. A choked sob escaped my lips as the weight of my actions crushed me. I wanted to scream, to beg, to undo everything. But I couldn't. The damage had already been done. Ethan wanted a divorce. He had meant it. And I couldn't even blame him. But I couldn't let this be the end. I wiped my tears and stood, my legs weak beneath me. I needed to fight. If I had any hope of saving my marriage, of proving to Ethan that I did care, I had to act now. I took a deep breath and marched downstairs, determined to find him. But Ethan was already in the foyer, with a suitcase. My heart stopped. What are you doing? He didn't look at me as he zipped up the bag. I told you, Emily. I'm done. No, I stepped closer. You don't get to just leave. He let out a breath, finally looking up at me. You left first. I flinched. That's not fair. Ethan shook his head. Fair? Fair would have been having my wife stand beside me while I buried our son. Fair would have been you choosing our family over your father. Tears spilled over, but he didn't soften. You made your choice, Emily, he continued. Now I'm making mine. Panic gripped me. You can't do this. Ethan's expression darkened. You don't get to tell me what I can and can't do. Not anymore. I reached for his arm, desperate. Ethan, please. I love you. His entire body went rigid. Slowly, he turned to me, his lips curling into a bitter smirk. You love me. Yes. He laughed. But it wasn't warm. It was sharp, hollow. If you loved me, you wouldn't have abandoned me. My breath hitched. I wasn't thinking. No, he agreed. You weren't. I swallowed hard. I made a mistake, Ethan. Terrible mistake. But don't throw us away over this. He exhaled, rubbing his temple. For a moment I hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would reconsider. But then his eyes met mine and I knew. It was already too late. This isn't just about the party, Emily, he said, voice quiet but firm. It's about everything. I shook my head. No, Ethan. We can fix this. He let out a slow, measured breath. Tell me something. I nodded quickly. Anything. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. If I hadn't done what I did, if I hadn't shown up at that party and humiliated your father, would you still be here? I froze. Ethan tilted his head. Would you have ever come back home? My throat tightened. Of course I would. His eyes narrowed. Would you? The silence stretched between us, suffocating. I opened my mouth then closed it, because deep down we both knew the answer. I hadn't come home that night because I realized my mistake. I had come home because I had nowhere else to go. Ethan's jaw clenched and he nodded, as if he had just confirmed everything he already suspected. And then he grabbed his suitcase and walked past me. Ethan, wait. He didn't. The door slammed shut behind him. And just like that he was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door like I could will him to come back. But he didn't. Hours passed. Then days. Ethan never returned. I called him. I texted. I begged. But he ignored every attempt. The house felt empty without him. The silence was unbearable. I had spent so much time trying to escape this place, trying to run from the grief, that I hadn't realized something crucial. Ethan had been the only thing holding me together. Without him I was nothing. My father called, of course. He tried to convince me that Ethan was the one in the wrong, that he had overreacted. But I wasn't blind anymore. I had backed the wrong man. I had chosen my father over my husband, and now I had nothing left. Then one night, nearly a week later, my phone rang. My heart leapt when I saw Ethan's name on the screen. I answered immediately. Ethan. But it wasn't his voice that greeted me. It was a woman's. Emily, she asked. This is Sophia. I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Ethan's lawyer. I felt my stomach drop. I just wanted to call and let you know that Ethan has officially filed for divorce. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. What? Sophia sighed. He's done, Emily. He asked me to keep this civil, so we'll be sending over the paperwork in the next few days. No, I whispered. No, he wouldn't. But he would. And he had. I barely heard the rest of what she said. The blood rushed in my ears, drowning out everything. The conversation ended. The phone slipped from my fingers. And for the first time in weeks I truly felt the weight of my grief. 'Cause now I had lost everything. My son. My husband. My marriage. And the worst part? I had no one to blame but myself. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later. A thick envelope placed neatly in my mailbox, as if it were just another piece of ordinary mail, like a bill or a catalog. But when I saw Ethan's name on the return address, my knees nearly buckled. I brought the envelope inside with shaking hands. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ethan and I used to have coffee together every morning, where Caleb used to color outside the lines in his coloring books, his little tongue poking out in concentration. I traced my fingers over the smooth surface, my vision blurring. This was really happening. Ethan wasn't just angry. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't waiting for me to beg hard enough for him to come back. He was done. The weight of that realization crushed me. For the past week I had convinced myself that I could still fix this. That if I just gave him space, if I just apologized enough times, he'd see how sorry I was. But this was final. A divorce meant Ethan didn't want to fix things. It meant he didn't want to try. It meant that I had lost him for good. I clenched my teeth and tore open the envelope, my eyes scanning the neatly typed legal jargon. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Ethan had already signed it. A sob built in my throat, but I swallowed it down, my hands tightening into fists. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to break. Because if I did, then I'd have to admit that this was my fault. I already knew it was my fault, of course. But knowing it and accepting it were two very different things. I forced myself to focus. He wasn't trying to take the house. He wasn't asking for anything. Just a clean, quick break. It was almost worse that way, because it meant that Ethan wasn't just leaving me. He didn't even want to fight for anything. I sat there for hours staring at the papers, my mind racing in circles. And then when the sun had long since set and the house felt unbearably empty, I did the only thing I could think of. I went to see my father. The moment I stepped into his house, no, Ethan's house, even though my father still refused to accept it, I knew I had made a mistake. Richard Lancaster was not a man who comforted. He was a man who controlled. And right now I was too weak to resist him. Well, my father said smoothly from his spot by the fireplace, sipping a glass of scotch. Look who finally decided to stop sulking. I stiffened. I haven't been sulking. He smirked. Oh, I'm sorry. What do they call it when someone loses everything because of their own bad decisions? Reflection. The word stung, but I didn't let it show. I need your help, I admitted, swallowing my pride. His smirk widened. Now that is something I never thought I'd hear. I clenched my jaw. Ethan filed for divorce. My father sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Yes, I heard. I frowned. How? He gave me a pointed look. Emily, please. The man humiliated me in front of half the city. You think I don't have people keeping tabs on him? I swallowed down my unease. I don't want this divorce. My father let out a low chuckle. You don't want a lot of things, sweetheart. But that's never stopped them from happening, has it? I dug my nails into my palms. Dad, I'm serious. He studied me for a moment, then sighed dramatically. And what exactly do you expect me to do about it? I hesitated. I hated asking him for anything. I knew it would come with a price. But I was desperate. You have connections, I said carefully. You know how to handle situations. He raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to interfere with your divorce proceedings? I hesitated. Emily. His voice dropped lower. Do you really want to be that woman? The one who forces a man to stay when he doesn't want to? I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Because that was the brutal truth, wasn't it? Ethan didn't want me anymore. He didn't want us. I wasn't fighting for our marriage. I was fighting for something that was already gone. My father must have seen the realization dawn on my face, because he sighed and stood up, walking toward me with a softened expression. Look, darling, he murmured, placing a hand on my shoulder. I know this hurts. But men like Ethan. His voice turned sharp. They don't forgive. I swallowed hard. You made your choice, he continued. You sided with me. That's not something a man like him will ever forget. I flinched. But, he added, tilting his head, maybe that's not such a bad thing. I frowned. What? He gestured around us. You don't need him, Emily. You were never meant for a life of mediocrity. You're a Lancaster. That means something. And if Ethan was too weak to handle that, he scoffed, then maybe you were never meant to be with him in the first place. Something inside me cracked. He wasn't wrong. Ethan never would have forgiven me, even if I begged, even if I tore myself apart trying to prove that I was sorry. He had already written me off. So why the hell was I still clinging to the idea of a life with a man who wanted nothing to do with me? I straightened my shoulders. You're right. My father smiled. Of course I am. I exhaled slowly. What do I do now? He finished the rest of his drink in one long sip, then set the glass down. You move forward, sweetheart. The way we always do. I nodded even though my chest ached. Ethan was gone. And maybe it was time I started acting like it. That I told myself that I was done grieving. That if Ethan didn't want me, if he had truly walked away without a second thought, then I would do the same. That I could do the same. It was a lie, of course. But it was a lie I needed to believe. The next few weeks passed in a blur. I moved out of the house. The one Ethan and I had built together. The one where Caleb's laughter had once filled every room. I had tried to pack quickly, not allowing myself to linger too long in the bedroom we had shared. In the kitchen where Ethan used to steal kisses while making coffee. In Caleb's room where his stuffed animals still sat in neat little rows. I left most of it behind. I couldn't take those memories with me. Instead, I moved into one of my father's condos downtown. A sleek modern place that felt more like a high-end hotel than a home. It was cold, empty, soulless. But at least there were no ghosts there. I spent my days pretending. Pretending I was fine. Pretending I wasn't devastated every time I woke up alone in a bed that wasn't ours. Pretending that I wasn't checking my phone for a message that would never come. Pretending I wasn't waiting for Ethan to change his mind. Because deep down, even if I had told my father I was ready to move on, I wasn't. Then came the night of the gala. My father insisted I go. You need to remind people who you are, he had said, standing in my condo with a glass of bourbon in hand, watching as I smoothed down the silky fabric of my dress in the mirror. Who I was. As if I hadn't spent the last decade as Ethan's wife. As if my entire world hadn't been tied to him, to Caleb, to a life that had now crumbled into dust. But my father didn't see it that way. He saw Ethan as a mistake I had made. And this gala? This was his way of erasing it. So I went. I wore the expensive designer dress he had picked out. I let him parade me around the room, introducing me to business associates and potential suitors, men with firm handshakes and empty smiles. I laughed when I was supposed to. I smiled when expected. I played the part. And for a while it worked. Until I saw him. Ethan. I hadn't seen him in weeks. Not since the night he walked out. And yet, there he was across the room, standing by the bar in a tailored suit that fit him too well, his hair slightly tousled, his sharp features unreadable as he nursed a glass of bourbon. My breath hitched. I told myself not to stare, not to care. But I did. I watched as a woman approached him, tall, elegant, beautiful. She placed a hand on his arm, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. And Ethan? He smiled. Not the polite, distant smile he used for business acquaintances. A real smile. A smile I hadn't seen in months. It felt like a punch to the stomach. Because in that moment I knew. Ethan wasn't grieving me the way I was grieving him. He wasn't waiting for me to come back. He was already moving on. And I had no one to blame but myself. I should have walked away. The moment I saw Ethan smile at her, I should have turned on my heel and left the gala. I should have reminded myself that I was supposed to be moving on. That I was here to prove something. To my father, to myself, to everyone who had been watching my downfall unfold in whispers and speculation. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, my stomach twisting as I watched Ethan lean toward the woman. His lips forming words I couldn't hear. His expression relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in so long. And the worst part? It wasn't just that he looked happy. It was that he looked free. Like losing me had been a relief. Emily. My father's voice cut through my thoughts, his hand landing firmly on my arm. I startled, blinking up at him. He was frowning, following my gaze to where Ethan stood. Then, after a moment, he let out a short, dry chuckle. Well, well, he mused, tilting his glass toward Ethan's direction. Seems your husband isn't mourning the loss of his wife. The words stung more than they should have. He's not my husband anymore. Not really. Not after I let him walk away. My father must have seen the flicker of emotion on my face, because his grip on my arm tightened slightly. I told you, sweetheart. Men like him don't forgive. I pulled my gaze away from Ethan, shaking my father's hand off. I don't need a lecture right now. He smirked. Of course you don't. But you do need a distraction. I exhaled, willing myself to stay calm. What are you getting at? My father took a slow sip of his bourbon before nodding toward someone behind me. Turn around. I hesitated, but then I did. Just in time to see a man making his way toward me. Tall. Well-dressed. His hair styled perfectly, his confidence effortless. I recognized him immediately. Nathan Carter. My father's hand-picked replacement for Ethan. Emily. Nathan greeted smoothly, stopping in front of me with an easy smile. It's been a long time. I forced a polite expression onto my face. Nathan. He glanced toward Ethan, who was still talking to her, and then back at me, his smile widening just slightly. Looks like we're both single now. My stomach turned. I knew what this was. This wasn't about me. This was about appearances. About showing Ethan that I had moved on just as quickly as he had. About making it hurt. And for one awful second I actually considered it. I considered smiling back. I considered taking Nathan's offered hand. I considered pretending. But then, as if sensing my hesitation, Ethan's eyes flickered toward me. And just like that, everything else faded away. For a brief moment, our gazes locked across the crowded room. His expression didn't change. Not anger. Not regret. Just quiet, detached acceptance. Like he had already made peace with this. Like I was nothing to him now. And that hurt more than anything. Ethan didn't look away first. I did. Because I couldn't hold his gaze. Because in that moment, standing in a room full of people, with my father beside me and Nathan waiting for my response, I finally understood. This was it. There was no coming back from this. Whatever tiny sliver of hope I had been clinging to, hope that maybe Ethan still loved me, that maybe he was just hurting, that maybe he would eventually forgive me, was gone. He had moved on. And not just in the way that meant he was talking to another woman, smiling, looking alive in a way I hadn't seen in months. He had moved on from me. I was no longer something that hurt him. I was nothing at all. Emily. Nathan's voice was smooth, expectant. He extended his hand slightly, waiting. I had two choices. I could reach for it, let my father win, let the world see that I wasn't broken, that I didn't regret my choices, that I could move forward, that I was still a Lancaster, still my father's daughter, still playing the game the way I was supposed to. Or I could stop pretending. I turned back to my father. I can't do this. His lips parted slightly. Excuse me. I took a shaky breath. I can't stand here and act like any of this matters. I can't pretend that I don't care. That I'm not. My voice broke, but I forced myself to keep going. That I'm not completely destroyed by what I did to my marriage. My father's expression hardened. Emily. Now is not the time. Yes, it is. My voice was firmer now. This is exactly the time. I turned to Nathan, offering him the smallest, most apologetic smile I could manage. I'm sorry, Nathan, but I'm not interested. Surprise flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it with a charming smirk. Fair enough. And then before my father could grab my arm, before he could say something that would make me feel weak, I stepped away. I walked across the ballroom, pushing through the bodies, ignoring the quiet murmurs that followed in my wake. Ethan watched me approach, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't do anything. I stopped just a few feet away, my heart pounding. The woman beside him, her, gave me a small, polite smile before murmuring something to Ethan and stepping away, leaving just us. For the first time since he left. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the bar beside him. What are you doing, Emily? I hesitated. I don't know. Honesty. For the first time in months I was honest. He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. Well, that makes two of us. I swallowed hard. You look good. He arched an eyebrow. You came all the way over here to tell me that? No, I admitted. I came over here because I needed to see you. One last time. Ethan studied me for a long, silent moment, his gaze sharp, unreadable. Then finally he nodded. All right, he said simply. So see me. I did. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw what I had done. The weight he had carried. The way grief had hardened him in some places and softened him in others. The way he had rebuilt himself from the ruins I had left behind. I had spent so much time trying to figure out how to fix things, how to undo the past. But there was no fixing this. No undoing it. There was only this moment. And maybe that had to be enough. I took a slow, shaking breath. I'm sorry, Ethan. His jaw tensed, but he didn't look away. I know, he murmured. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anything, really. But it was the closest thing I was ever going to get. I forced a small, broken smile. Goodbye, Ethan. His throat bobbed slightly. And then, goodbye, Emily. That was it. That was the end of us. I turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. By the time I reached the doors, my father was already there, waiting. His face was unreadable, but I could feel his disappointment in waves. You just threw away everything, he murmured. I wiped at my cheek, smiling bitterly. No, Dad. I exhaled. I finally stopped pretending. And then I left. Because there was nothing left to stay for.